Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today's program will begin with our fifth keynote speaker, Associate Professor Gigi Luck, McGill University, Canada. Dr. Luck's research on the cognitive and neural consequences of bilingualism extends across the lifespan. She leads a research program that examines how diverse language experiences shape development and learning. Her research also examines how to harness scientific findings on bilingualism to improve educational experience for children from diverse language backgrounds. This morning and evening for her, Dr. Luck will be speaking to us on embracing language diversity in schools and societies. Dr. Luck, please.
Thank you for the invitation, and also thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. I wish I could see you in person, but of course we're 12 hours in a 12-hour difference. I'm in Montreal, Canada, so right now I am 12 hours behind you. And I also wanted to share with you that I have been just recovering from a cold, not COVID, but a cold. So I occasionally may lose my voice, but I'll try to speak slowly. Hopefully that will go without incident. So it's really my pleasure to speak to you all in Singapore because I study bilingualism. And as you know, Singapore is very multilingual. So in today's talk, I'm hoping to give you some of the information about the research that I've been doing, but I'm also expecting to learn from you who lived in a very multicultural community. And I have three things to talk about today. And the first one is that I would like to share with you that to not forget that multilingualism is not only a language experience, but it is also an interactional experience. And then I would like to bring that idea into languages, language acquisition, reading and reading difficulty in the school system. Finally, I would like to share with you some of my insights about how we can embrace language diversity at school and in societies. Importantly, my research is very interdisciplinary. And so I was trained as a psychologist in cognitive psychology. Then I completed training in neuroscience. And ultimately, I would like to do more work in education. So coming from these three disciplines, I will share with you some of the work that we've been doing. And another preamble is that I moved back to Canada from the US. So today, what you will see, it's most of the work that I have been doing in the United States. And a little bit of personal information. I grew up speaking multiple languages. I also lived in Singapore briefly when I was a child. And very often, I consider English as my dominant and most fluent language. And now I reside in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, which is a French province. So I have been living as a Cantonese speaker in English and French communities. And I also do my work from the perspective of a language minority. So with this preamble, I am going to start sharing a diagram with you that I hope will stay with you. And if you have any questions, you can also put it in the chat that I will take a look and also have other people help me to moderate the discussion. So when we think about language experience, we focus on the individual differences. So how early do you learn a language? How well do you speak your second language? And interestingly, language does not happen in a vacuum. What we always have to remember is that language experience is interactional, such that individual differences often interact with in that individual's linguistic environment, such as family, school, and community for children's perspective. And this interactional experiences is actually one that shapes the environment. And we now have to see, I put in some thought questions, and I hope that you would think a little bit about these questions, no matter where you're coming from. So the first thought question is, what are the languages spoken by members in your community? by knowing the languages spoken by the members in your community, we can then look at the context where the languages are being used and heard in children's life. So in Singapore, you guys are very multilingual. From the 2020 census, I gathered that many residents in Singapore speak English as their first language, and then you have a variety, a myriad of other languages that are also present. And of those who speak English as the first language, they also speak a variety of second language, such as Mandarin, Chinese dialects, Malay, Tamil, and the Indian languages. And 13% of the 48% of the individuals don't speak another language. And not only Singapore is multilingual, Singapore is also very multiliterate. People not only can speak multiple languages, they can also read in multiple languages. I remember my last visit to Singapore in 2018, seeing all the languages represented in the sign at the airport and hearing all the languages and dialect in the community really showcased that Singapore is a hodgepodge, a melting pot of languages. Now, compared to Europe, this is a very busy graph, and I know it's early in the morning. I hope you have your coffee with you. This is a data from Europe showing that across the European countries, most of them, the European Union in 2016, UK was still part of it, that the proportions of individuals who speak a foreign language. So yellow bars mean the proportion of individuals don't speak a foreign language. And all the other color bars indicates that they speak one foreign language, 2 or 3 foreign languages. So across the board, you can see that the most multilingual country in terms of proportions of adults speaking a foreign language is with Sweden. And the least multilingual country is United Kingdom. Well, that was back in 2016. And so compared to these statistics around the world, we can see that actually many people speak multiple languages. So how do we understand the interactional experience in the environment with the individual? Now, coming back to this graph, there are a couple of context here. So there's family, there's school, and there's community. And it is very challenging to look at community, how language are being used, and how that impact the children's immediate language experience. So I'm going to show you a study that we did in the United States by Dr. Sarah Soring, who was my former PhD student, who is currently a postdoctoral fellow in Houston. So in the United States, what we found was that there was very little work done on looking at the perceived social value of multilingualism. So we created a tool to assess this concept. And we looked at many different individuals. Altogether, we have over 400 respondents. But here, I'm just showing you the data from 319 parents with children. And even though English is used very prevalently in the United States, there are many other languages present in our sample. So maybe that people see that we're looking at multilingualism, and they're more, if they speak another language, they're more likely to participate. And while English is prevalent, we also see many other languages. And in the United States, actually the 5th most linguistically diverse country in the world. And we gather data from almost all parts of the country, except for the 2-3 states in the Midwest. And each of the green dots and pink square you see in the graph here, in the map here, indicates a data point that we obtained. And in this graph, in this map here, the blue area indicates a smaller portion of individuals from the census sharing that they don't speak another language, or they speak English at home. And hotter color, the red color, indicates that the locale has more individuals reporting that they speak a non-English language at home. And so if you have to make a guess, with the individuals who have different language experience. We could categorize them as speaking English as a first language, but never tried to learn a second language, or speak English as a first language, try second language learning, but they claim that they failed. Or they speak English as a first language, and they also speak another language fluently. And finally, we also have individuals who don't speak English as the first language. And so what we found was actually quite interesting. The people who don't speak English as a first language tend to value multilingualism more. But surprisingly, the people who speak English as a first language but never try to learn a second language has the most variability. So you can see that their rating goes from almost one end of the scale to the other end. So what we wanted to know is what makes them change their mind. And one thing we did was to extract from their IP address, extract the locale where they're responding our surveys from, and map it to the census data to see in their surroundings how the number of people who speak a non-English language in the community. And using that factor, it turns out that that is a significant predictor of how much you value bilingualism for those individuals who speak English as a first language but never try to learn a second language. So the more exposure you have to people who speak another language, even though you have never learned a second language, you tend to value multilingualism more. And there are also other factors, such as being female, have higher education, and being younger. So those are also factors that predict how much you value multilingualism. But then when we want to get to the crux of the question is whether this linguistic environment perception changes behavior. So of these 319 parents, we have about half of them who have toddlers. So we asked them in the past 2 weeks, have you engaged with your toddlers in these activities such as singing songs, talking during mealtime, telling a story, or reading books in their heritage language? And what we did was to predict how much do they value bilingualism, whether it predicts the likelihood that they engage in activity in their heritage language. And it turns out that the more a parent value multilingualism and of course are able to use the language at home, they're more likely to engage their children using their heritage language. So that all sounds really great. And now what we really want to bring this in is how does this represent in a school setting in the education system? Now, as I mentioned, United States is very linguistically diverse, even though in research or in many articles that you look at from the psychology research perspective, that there tends to be a categorical distinction between those who are multilingual versus those who are monolingual, English speaking. But in fact, multilingualism is multidimensional and it's continuous. And so far, we know there are a couple of factors that determine how multilingual you are. First one you can think of as how early did you learn or expose to another language? And how well do you speak your second or first language? Because the use of your native language or mother tongue in Singapore, it also changes when you learn another language. And we also look at how often do you actually use your languages in your daily life and whether it's persistent. But in education system, at least in the United States, it's more simplified. So if you are proficient in English, then you would be in this category called English proficient. But if you are not proficient in English, then you'll be assigned different labels depending on the times and the context where the labels are being used. And so again, it's also dichotomizing a complex multidimensional life experience into buckets. One bucket is English proficient, the other bucket is all the labels that you see here. Now, in the United States, the concentration of students who are deemed as not proficient in English reside in the darker green state here in the map. So as you can see, New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, Florida, and California have higher concentrations. And around in 2018, around 5 million students in the school system are deemed as English learners, or students who are not proficient in English, roughly 10%. And the majority of them are actually born in the country. While Spanish is the most representative, there's a huge variety of languages represented in this population. And they are mostly congregated in urban elementary school, or in some cases in rural areas that have a lot of migrant workers. They also experience high dropout rate at the high school. And in states that identify giftedness, they also experienced a very low gifted identification. Many of them are coming from low income background, though this is not always the case, and I'll show you some data. And they're also more likely to be identified as having specific learning disability, which I will talk a little bit more in the later in the presentation. Now, the historical narrative of English learners, it's not very pleasant. So in 1935, one of the earlier articles by Manuel, published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, have already identified that children who speak Spanish as a first language, according to this documentation, show lower academic performance in arithmetics and reading, so math and reading. And in the article, that's also the time when language handicap, the terminology language handicap that are being put forth. And that was published in 1935, but now it's 2022. We sometimes still hear parents or educators concerned about a child's bilingualism or multilingual experience being one that is hindering their development. Now, in the US, in some states, multilingualism is often associated with sociodemographic factors. So it is important that we recognize this and take that into account when we look at any sort of educational data. So when you look at data from 2015 at a state in the northeastern part of the United States, with a very large sample size, we can look at students that I categorize them into 4 groups based on the data that the school district the state department collected. The first group was that parents reported that the child's English, it's English. And then 3 other groups in which the parents reported that their first language is not English, but they have never received English learning service, meaning that they enter school being proficient in English, but also don't speak English as a first language. Or that they received English service, but then they reach a certain level of proficiency and get reclassified. Or they are currently receiving English language service. And so typically what we get in education data is not very specific. So we might be getting information or statistics looking at those who are proficient in English that are included in the yellow rectangle here versus those who are current English learners. So again, reflecting the dichotomy that I showed you in the black and whites. But then if we look at this gradient that I put forth to you in these 4 groups that I also put up here, we can see that if we look at the association with proportion of students coming from low income background here in this graph, representing about 52,000 children in 3rd grade, gray area means that the proportions of students coming from low-income background, white means they're not from low-income background. We can see that for those who reported English to be their first language, roughly about 30% of them are from low-income background. Compared to those who are current English learners, roughly 80% of them are coming from low-income background. And if you think that this might be the case that only in third grade, we've also looked at other grades, and the pattern is quite consistent. And recently, when we look at the 2019 data, the pattern of results are almost identical. So then when we look at these national report cards on reading in fourth grade and in eighth grade, when we look at these categories of English learners versus those who are proficient in English, their differences in performance are profound. But how much of their lower performance is due to their developing English? Remember, they're being tested to read in a language that they're still acquiring. And how much of this is also due to a socio-demographic factor that we know have very robust relationship in predicting performance in reading. And so when we look at multilingualism, at least in the case in the United States, we cannot ignore other socio-demographic factors that might vary with multilingualism. So for the educators in the audience, I would like to ask you the third question. How are children's home language backgrounds assessed in schools in your place? And are children's academic performance considered in light of the interaction between language background and socio-demographic factors? And now I'm going to switch gear a little bit to reading. So now we know that English learners who are in the process of acquiring English has difficulty in literacy-related tasks. And at the same time, what we are also struggling with in practice and in research is how do we identify children who need more time to learn the second language or those who struggle with reading genuinely. So reading difficulty is a difficulty in learning to read despite normal intelligence, perceptual abilities, and learning opportunities. And the core of the deficit seems to be in fluency, decoding, and comprehension. Currently, there's no statistical estimate of the prevalence of reading difficulty in second language readers. This is also because that multilingualism is very diverse around the world. Remember the graph from the EU data that I showed you, even within the EU, we see a lot of variation in the proportions of individuals who speak multiple languages. So what we do know is that reading difficulty has a biological etiology, but at the same time, how do we estimate statistics for among multilingual learners is very challenging. For example, here in Montreal, the majority of people and children speak multiple languages. So the prevalence rate would be different than when you are in a more monolingual country. And there is also very little reason to believe that reading difficulty rates would be higher in children with diverse language experiences. If anything, they have more exposure to different languages. Shouldn't they be more attuned to how text works? And reading difficulty can also be a standalone condition or behavioral symptom or a comorbid condition such as ADHD. So with all this information coming together, we still don't know much about learning difficulty. And in the US education system, there is a category called specific learning disability that I mentioned before that many English learners are identified with. And this term includes actually many different conditions, such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. So with all these different conditions, it is not surprising to see that it also has one of the highest level of incident rate because it's so broad. So if you don't fit into other categories, you'll probably be included in this one. So in a new destination state in the south of the country, we also see that second language proficiency modulates the special education risk ratio in general. So this go across different category. And the black line indicates the 10-year statistics from 2009 all the way to 2019. So in this state, at least, it's actually quite consistent. And same for other bilingual groups. So there are current English learners and also English proficient bilinguals. They are all quite similarly stable across the 10-year span, although the English proficient bilinguals are consistently lower, have a lower risk ratio compared to the other two groups. And the current English learners also have lower risk ratio compared to native English speakers. And I'm not going to talk too much about the WAVE English learners group because they are actually parents who waive the English service even though the children are deemed to benefit from it. Again, socioeconomic status, in this case, in this state, is lunch status also modulate these proportions that I showed you. And so one question that we've asked by Dr. Laura Maseed, my former student, is how confident are educators when they assess reading difficulty in multilingual children? We looked at close to 1,000 participants across the United States. Majority of them only speak English. And we asked them, please rate your level of confidence identifying or diagnosing reading difficulty. And their confidence level are pretty high. So 10 indicates they're most confident and 0 is not confident at all. But when we asked them to rate their level of confidence identifying or diagnosing reading difficulty in English learners, the distribution dropped. And so here I decided to just show you the histogram because the raw data is the most powerful. A lot of them say they are least confident, and many of them are putting their responses in 5, which means they are really 50-50. And that's very challenging. So we also asked them in smaller focus group, what are the challenges? And some of the challenges are that there's not adequate personnel who speak multiple languages to serve the community, or that they don't have the assessment, or that they don't have sufficient training to identify reading difficulty in children who are not yet fluent in English. So if you are an educator, how is reading or literacy in general assessed in your organization? And what are the considerations for children being tested in their second or additional language? So now the burning question really is, how do we reliably identify bilingual, multilingual children with reading difficulty? How do we differentiate developing second literacy proficiency from reading difficulty? And here I'm going to propose that we should conduct more research with individuals from different disciplines. For example, using cognitive neuroscience. We don't know a lot about neuroscience and education per se, but we do know a lot about neuroscience and learning. And if we put education as a context, we can then know more about how these multidimensional relationships work together. So why do we use neuroscience? One thing is that if neuroscience forces our narrative to step away from relative comparisons. Even when I showed you my own research comparing groups, I can't help but say this group is performing higher than the other groups. But in neuroscience, there's no such thing as this group has better brain than the other group, as you will see later. And so in a way, we try to understand the process of the mechanism behind the behavioral symptoms that we observe. and formulate evidence-informed solution. I also wanted to state that neuroscience is not the silver bullet to solve educational problem, but it's a tool or it's a proxy that we could use and leverage to come up with solutions that are backed by science and also provide a more creative avenue to understand children with multilingual experience. So a partnership like this is complicated, as you may imagine. First, we need to be inspired by an educational challenge and have neuroscientists who are willing to step out of the laboratory, going into schools and classroom and understand the everyday experiences of children's learning environment. And we also have to design ecologically relevant task and analysis. Now, I'm not going to say that this is going to be ecologically valid because there's no way learning happens like how you lie in an MRI machine, but we can make the task ecologically relevant. So in our brain, there are a couple of things that we can look at. We can look at the general structure, we can look at brain activity, and we can also look at white matter structure. And I'm going to show you a little bit of data about this. So what we know about bilingualism is that when you asked a group of adults, at what age did you start learning your second most proficient language, their responses correlate with the fractional anisotropy, which is an indicator of the water diffusion molecules in the white matter tracts in the corpus callosum. So corpus callosum is the brain structure in white matter that connects the two hemispheres. And we found similar findings in different regions among a group of bilingual adolescents who speak Spanish as a first language and learn English while they're in the United States. And in this case, we see that their correlation are they're observed in the posterior or towards the back of the brain more so than the adults. Then what about learning new information? So we took a science curricula and turned it into a script that a teacher would actually use in classroom teaching. And then we record that video by controlling with a lot of things. And then we also sit with a group of teachers to come up with a grading rubric. And the final product is a 6.5-minute video that we show children in the scanner. And so it goes like this. We ask them a couple of questions just to make sure that they don't know what we're about to show them. And then we put them in a scanner and show them the video while they listen to the speech. And then when they come out, we ask them what they have learned. We also ask very specific questions about the video that we showed. And in addition to Spanish-English bilingual adolescents, we also have English-speaking adolescents and a group of English-speaking adolescents with reading difficulty. So I'm going to click in this video so you can see that the bilingual children and the English-speaking adolescents with reading difficulty all have extensive network. Compared to the English-speaking adolescents in the middle, their networks are much more extensive, although the bilingual individuals have more frontal activations compared to the English-speaking adolescents with reading difficulty, more activations towards the back of their head. And again, another line of work completed by my former student, Dr. Sibila Leon Guerrero, who is now a postdoctoral fellow at UC Irvine. She wants to look at brain networks. So what areas of the brain show correlating activity with a region that is heavily related to syntactic processing in the frontal area of the brain in the left hemisphere. So in this network, we can see that for the English-speaking adolescents, the network is more or less confined in the left hemisphere, but compared to the bilingual the adolescents, the network is more by in both hemisphere, in both left and right hemisphere. Again, we do another cross-check just to make sure the results are sound. We use a different seat at the posterior part of the brain that process language comprehension. Remember, they're watching the video. Again, the activation or the brain network that we observed in the English-speaking adolescents. I am very sorry about that. Are very confined to the left hemisphere, while for the bilingual individuals, the activations are more bilateral in both hemispheres. So looking at these results, what we know is that when we say learning in a second language is more effortful, now we have evidence to show that they are more effortful as they recruit additional brain regions to solve the task at hand, which is learning in their second language. And so another question that we could ask is, remember the 1935 paper that I showed you of language handicap? Does learning another language also means that your first language is going to go down in performance? So from Sibylla's work, we see that it's not the case. The better that adolescents do in the Spanish close reading tests, they also do better in English comprehension, and that modulated by the complexity of the text that they're reading. Similarly, when we look at their eye movement when they're reading, the better that they perform in Spanish actually show more efficient reading in their eye movement. So in summary, multilingualism has different meanings across different countries, different settings, or different settings within countries. It also presents an interaction between an individual and her language environment. And in the intersection of multilingualism, reading, and reading difficulty, it reflects a realistic, practical challenge in education. And multilingual experience is associated with differences in brain structures and activation when learning new language in a second or subsequent language. Now, these are all research summaries that I share with you coming from the perspective of North America. And what we don't know is, do these results changes as we go to a different community, such as here in Montreal, which is very multilingual, or in Singapore? And some of the practical implications that we think about is the support for multilingual learners should begin with a community goal that is sensitive and equitable for all students, not only for a selected field, and also for children who speak a minority language in a majority community. Learning in a majority language, it's already an immersion education for them. So taking that into account, what we then have to figure out is how to lessen the load and support them when they struggle with learning in a second language. Now, intervention or pedagogy, so far, it's not entirely different for multilingual learners. So it's not like you have to dedicate resources to serve children who speak multiple languages. And very importantly, how do we turn linguistic challenges into linguistic assets in the community, particularly in school? And diversity, language diversity, should not only be recognized as a statistic, but also embraced into strategic educational planning. And this is where we will have to look at the individual context and also the social context where education and multilingualism occurs. So the knowledge of process here, I'm advocating for the use of cognitive neuroscience, facilitates the understanding of student groups who show similar outcomes. And neuroscience not only pushes the discourse beyond relative comparison and look at the mechanism behind these observations. And understanding the process would allow educators to identify areas to improve that will shape and enrich pedagogy and support for all learners. So where do we go from here? at least in my paradigm of research, what I would like to do is to use the individual and interactional experience to explore in different domains of knowledge and disciplines in order to create and generate linguistically sensitive pedagogy and community support. I myself alone cannot do all of this. So it is important that researchers and practitioners build bridges and work with each other to inform each other, both in scholarly knowledge advancement as well as in practice. And again, I can't do all of this by myself. So I thank my team formerly and in my previous institution and currently at McGill. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Luck. It's fascinating research between neuroscience and multilingualism. We have some questions via Slido, and I'm going to read out some of them for you to take. The first question is, if during the process of teaching, teachers were to code switch between the students' proficient language and the new language that the students are learning, how would this influence the students' progress of learning the new language? Would you like me to repeat it?
Excellent question. Yes, so I think this is an excellent question because in the past, you may have heard of the fact that code switching is not a very acceptable behavior, but recent research, at least in the framework of translanguaging, actually sees all languages as a repertoire for an individual to use as a linguistic asset. So if a teacher uses a language and then switches to another to help a child understand, I think it's not going to damage the child's language repertoire. And in a way, it would also facilitate understanding. And it also sets a model of the teacher respecting the languages that the child brings to the classroom.
Thank you. Very interesting perspective. Another question that we have here is, what does neuroscience have to show about the benefits of being multilingual or bilingual?
Well, thank you for this question. One thing I do want to say that when we say benefits or advantages, what we're saying is we're comparing a bilingual group to a monolingual group. And in this case, it really depends on who the monolinguals are. So it's all a relative comparisons. One thing that I have already shown you is that it's more effortful when children learn new information in their second or subsequent language. And if you imagine this experience being more persistent, it happens day after day, month after month, and that will as a consequence to seeing changes in brain structure, just like I showed you in the adult data, that in the brain structure, you see differences that correlates with how early that they use their second most proficient language. So I don't think the question should be looking at the neural origins of the bilingual advantage per se, but what we do know is that our brain is plastic. Any experiences that forces us to use more effortful processes and be engaged is going to change our brain structure. And that's one thing that I'm advocating in neuroscience, to step away from relative comparisons in behavior. So there's no better or worse, but there's differences, and we're plastic and we adapt to the environment.
And that's an encouraging thought, really. We have time for a last question, I think, and so that goes. What impact do culture and language have on a family's involvement in school and on their child's education?
Excellent ending question for this plenary talk. What I have not investigated in depth is the role of culture. But remember, in the first set of studies that I showed you, that we know that if parents value multilingualism as an experience, they're more likely to use that language with their child. And in a way, the parents are showing more respect to their heritage language And this will also transmit to the child to respect the languages and their own heritage language and culture. Language is a window to culture, and there is no way you can look at one without the other. Research is limited in this sense, but for holistic lens, as a parent raising a bilingual child, a multilingual child, and as a multilingual parent, I can tell you that it really broadens your child's cultural perspective and the respect for other people's culture and behavior.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Yep. Thank you, Dr. Luck, for sharing with us your thoughts. As a token of our appreciation, we'll be sending Dr. Luck a copper plug. Dr. Luck, thank you once again for your keynote speech and also for spending time with us this evening for you. Have a great evening ahead.